I was standing in the snow outside my mother's house when I found out I had been written out of my own family. The locksmith wouldn't look me in the eye as he changed the deadbolt. He kept his voice polite professional as if this were just another Tuesday morning job. Behind him, through the frosted glass, I could see my younger brother moving through the hallway I grew up in, carrying boxes like he belonged there and I didn't. That was how it started. Not with shouting, not with a fight, just the quiet sound of metal clicking into place and the sudden understanding that whatever I thought family meant had already been decided without me. My name is Hannah Mercer. I was 31 years old that winter. Old enough to know better, young enough to still believe that if you showed up, if you did the right things long enough, it would count for something. I was wrong. People like to imagine betrayal as dramatic. Screaming matches, slam doors, someone saying something unforgivable. But the most damaging betrayals are administrative. Paperwork, decisions made in rooms you were never invited into, conversations that end with signatures instead of apologies. The snow was coming down lightly, the kind that looks peaceful until it soaks through your coat. I stood on the walkway holding a cardboard box of my things, watching a man I didn't know lock me out of the house my father built with his own hands. Inside that house were my childhood bedrooms, my parents' photos, the dining table where we spent every Thanksgiving, pretending we liked each other more than we did. Inside that house was my mother, Eleanor Mercer, who had asked me to come over that morning to talk. She didn't come to the door. My brother did. Caleb was 28, 3 years younger than me, and always the easier one. Easier to forgive, easier to favor, easier to shape into whatever version of success our mother liked to display. Hannah, he said, standing just inside the doorway. He didn't step outside. This doesn't have to be like this. That sentence should have made me angry. Instead, it made something inside me go quiet. Then why is there a locksmith here? I asked. He glanced over his shoulder toward the living room, where our mother was no doubt sitting very still, very composed, rehearsing the version of this story she would tell later. It's temporary, Caleb said. Mom just needs space. Things got complicated after Dad's will. That was the first time he said it out loud. The will. I nodded once. I didn't argue. I didn't ask to speak to her. I didn't remind him that I'd moved back home 2 years earlier to help care for our father, while Caleb stayed in Chicago, building a career in corporate finance and posting photos from rooftop bars. I didn't remind him of the nights I slept on a chair beside Dad's hospital bed, or the mornings I argued with insurance companies, or the fact that I had put my own job on hold because family comes first was something my mother raised us to believe. I simply said, "Tell her I'll be in touch." Then I walked back to my car. The house sat at the end of a quiet suburban street in Glen Ridge, Ohio. Modest, well-kept, nothing flashy. It was never about money, my mother liked to say. It was about stability, about appearances, about doing things the right way. I had always been the inconvenient variable in her system. I didn't marry early. I didn't choose a man she approved of. I worked in compliance and risk assessment, a job that required me to notice uncomfortable truths and document them clearly. I asked questions. I read contracts. I didn't smooth things over when something felt wrong. Caleb, on the other hand, made her life easier. He smiled at the right moments. He agreed when she spoke. He understood instinctively that love in our family was conditional, and that the safest way to keep it was not to test its limits. When Dad died, everything shifted. On paper, it looked simple. A modest estate, the house, a small investment account, Dad's share in a local logistics company he'd helped start years earlier with his brother. What wasn't simple was my mother's sudden urgency to reorganize. She told me not to worry, that she had everything under control, that Caleb would be helping her with the financial details because he understood these things better. I should have paid attention to that sentence. 3 weeks after the funeral, I asked to see the will. She told me it wasn't necessary. 6 weeks later, she told me the house would eventually go to Caleb because it just made more sense. 2 months after that, she asked me when I planned to move out. I remember standing in the kitchen that morning, the same kitchen where Dad used to read the paper, while Mom made coffee, and realizing that the ground had already shifted beneath my feet. I wasn't being pushed out in one move. I was being managed out, slowly, carefully, with just enough plausible deniability that no one could accuse her of cruelty. By the time the locksmith arrived, the decision had already been finalized. As I drove away, the box on the passenger seat rattled softly with every turn. Old mail. A framed photo of my parents at Niagara Falls. A mug that said, "World's okayest daughter, a joke Dad used to love." I pulled over a few blocks away and just sat there, not crying, not shaking, just staring at the steering wheel while my mind replayed every moment from the last 2 years, rearranging them into a pattern I could no longer ignore. I had been useful, and then I had been inconvenient. That was the whole story. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "We'll talk when things calm down. Please don't make this harder than it has to be." I didn't respond. I started the engine and drove to my apartment, a small one-bedroom I had kept even after moving back home temporarily. At the time, my mother had called it unnecessary, wasteful. Now it felt like the only reason I wasn't completely homeless. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down everything I knew. Dates, conversations, documents I had seen, things that had been said casually as if they didn't matter. By midnight, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't about grief. This wasn't about space. This was about control. And control, once exposed, has a way of unraveling the people who rely on it most. I didn't know yet how things would turn. I didn't know who would lose what. But as I closed the notebook and set it aside, I felt the shift. The moment where observation becomes preparation. The moment where silence stops being passive and starts becoming deliberate. Because if my family thought I would quietly accept being erased, they had made a very expensive miscalculation. The first thing I did the next morning was request a copy of my father's will. Not from my mother, from the county. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes when you stop asking people who benefit from your confusion to explain things to you. I had learned that lesson slowly, but once it settled, it didn't leave. I took the day off work. Not because I needed rest, but because I needed quiet. The kind of quiet where you can read line by line without anyone interrupting to tell you what something really means. The probate office was beige and forgettable, the kind of place designed to drain emotion out of everything that passes through it. A clerk with tired eyes slid a manila folder across the counter after checking my ID. No questions, no sympathy, just process. That folder weighed more than it should have. I sat in my car afterward and opened it carefully like it might bite. Dad's handwriting appeared on the first page, shaky but unmistakable. I hadn't seen it since before he got sick. I read slowly. The will was older than I expected. Dated 6 years back. Before the stroke. Before the hospital bills. Before my mother's voice became sharper and more controlled in the way it always did when she felt cornered. The terms were clear. The house was to remain in my mother's possession during her lifetime. After that, it was to be split evenly between Caleb and me. The investment account split evenly. Dad's share in Mercer and Lane Logistics split evenly. There were no conditions, no vague language, no room for interpretation. I sat there for a long time, the engine off the heater humming softly, watching my breath fog the windshield. So this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a rewrite. I flipped to the final pages and saw the amendment. Filed 8 months ago, after Dad was already gone. A trust restructure signed solely by my mother, citing family consensus and efficiency of management. I felt my jaw tighten, but still no anger came. Just focus. Because while my mother had always been good at managing people, she was not good at managing paper. She relied on confidence, not accuracy. On the assumption that no one would check. I checked. The amendment transferred operational control of the logistics shares to Caleb immediately with full voting rights. It also designated him as the sole future beneficiary of the property, citing my voluntary relocation as evidence that I no longer required housing consideration. Voluntary. I let out a slow breath. That word would matter later. I drove home and laid everything out on my kitchen table. The will, the amendment, my notes. My phone filled with old messages I had never thought to delete. I didn't call a lawyer yet. I wanted to understand the full shape of the thing before I handed it to someone else. That afternoon, Caleb called. I watched his name light up on my screen until it stopped. Then he texted, "Mom's really upset. You disappearing like that didn't help." I typed deleted, then finally sent "I've seen Dad's will." 3 dots appeared almost instantly, then vanished, then appeared again. "What do you mean?" "I mean the version Dad signed," I wrote, "not the one Mom filed after." There was a longer pause this time. "Hannah, you're overthinking this. Lawyers handle these things. It's not personal." That was Caleb's favorite phrase. Not personal. When you tell someone their home is no longer theirs, but call it logistics. When you erase their inheritance, but frame it as practicality. when you cut them out but insist it's just business. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and logged into the shared drive Dad had insisted we all use years ago for company documents. At the time, Mom had rolled her eyes. Caleb had joked about old men and their filing habits. Dad hadn't laughed. The files were still there. Meeting minutes, emails, shareholder agreements, notes from conversations Caleb and my mother assumed no one else cared about. I didn't read everything. I skimmed with purpose. And then I saw it. An email chain from 9 months ago between my mother and the company's outside accountant. Subject line: restructure timing. My mother had written, "Once Hannah moves out permanently, we should finalize the transfer. I don't want confusion later." The accountant had replied, "We'll need documentation that the relocation was voluntary." My mother's response came an hour later. "I'll handle that." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. This wasn't grief. This was planning. That evening, I cooked dinner for one and ate standing at the counter the way I always did when my mind was busy. The food barely registered. I wasn't sad yet. Sadness would come later in quieter moments. Right now, I was cataloging. At 8:42 p.m., my mother finally called. "Hannah," she said, her voice already layered with exhaustion and authority. "I don't understand why you're doing this." Doing what I asked. Making everything adversarial. We're a family. I pictured her in the living room, sitting very straight, hands folded, convinced that posture could still control outcomes. "I didn't make anything adversarial," I said. "I asked for documents." "You moved out," she said. "You made choices." "I moved in with you to care for Dad," I replied. "I kept my apartment the entire time. You asked me to stay." She sighed, sharp and performative. "Caleb needs stability. He has responsibilities. You're independent." There it was. The justification she'd rehearsed. "I was independent when it was convenient," I said. "I was family when you needed help. Now I'm optional." "That's not fair," she snapped. "I haven't accused you of fairness," I said. "I'm asking about legality." Silence. Not the quiet of confusion. The quiet of recalculation. "We'll discuss this later," she said finally. "Not like this." "I agree," I said. "Not like this." I hung up before she could say more. That night, I emailed a lawyer. Her name was Rachel Coleman. I found her through a colleague who described her as unimpressed by emotional manipulation. That sounded right. I didn't tell her everything in the email, just enough to schedule a consultation. Then I slept, really slept. Because once you stop trying to earn love from people who trade it for leverage, your body does something strange. It rests. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. Not revenge, not confrontation, documentation. Because families who rely on silence panic when you start naming things clearly. And I was done being quiet in ways that protected everyone but me. Rachel Coleman didn't waste time on sympathy. She read everything I brought her in silence, flipping pages with steady fingers, occasionally making a small mark in the margin. Her office was spare and bright legal pads stacked neatly, no family photos on the desk. I liked that immediately. Nothing in the room suggested she confused feelings with facts. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at me over her glasses. "Before I tell you what I think she said, I want to ask you a few questions. And I need you to answer them carefully, not how things felt, how they happened." I nodded. "Did your father ever express an intention to disinherit you?" "No." "Did you sign anything relinquishing your interest in the estate or the company?" "No." "Did you move out of the family home permanently before his death?" "No, I kept my apartment the entire time." "Do you have proof of that?" "Yes. Lease, utilities, rent payments, everything." She made another mark. "Did your mother ever tell you the will had been amended?" "No." "Did she present the trust restructure as something you had agreed to?" "She said it was handled and not something I needed to worry about." Rachel leaned back slightly. "That's good," she said. I blinked. "Good. It means she relied on your silence, not your consent." She slid one document back toward me, the amendment. "This," she said, tapping it once, "is not as airtight as she thinks." For the first time since this started, something warm moved through my chest. Not hope, not relief. Momentum. Rachel explained it plainly. The amendment didn't override the will. It attempted to bypass it through a trust mechanism, but it hinged on a claim that my circumstances had changed voluntarily and with full awareness. "That claim is weak," Rachel said. "Especially given the timing, and especially if we can show you were materially involved in caretaking and business continuity at the time." I thought of the nights I answered emails from the logistics clients while Dad slept. The calls I took when shipments were delayed. The meeting I attended on Caleb's behalf when he was too busy to fly in. "I can show that," I said. "I know," Rachel replied. "You wouldn't be here otherwise." She closed the folder. Here's what I want you to understand, she continued. This isn't about suing your family into submission. This is about leverage. And leverage comes from clarity. She outlined the next steps: a formal request for accounting, a notice of interest, a temporary injunction to prevent further transfer of assets until the matter was resolved. It will feel aggressive, she said, because they're used to operating without resistance, but legally, it's restrained. I smiled once thinly. That's fine. She studied me for a moment. You're not angry, she observed. No, I said, I'm finished. That seemed to satisfy her. 2 days later, the letters went out. Not emotional letters, not accusations. Clean professional notices drafted in language that left no room for misinterpretation. By Friday afternoon, my phone was lighting up. Caleb called first. Hannah! What the hell is this? He demanded. Why are lawyers contacting Mom? Because paperwork matters, I said. You didn't have to do it like this. There wasn't another way, I replied. You made sure of that. He scoffed. You're blowing this up for no reason. For a reason, I corrected. Several. You just didn't expect me to name them. You're going to tear the family apart. That one landed differently. Because it was something I used to fear. Now it sounded like an accusation from someone standing on a structure that had already cracked. I didn't start this, I said. I'm responding to it. He lowered his voice. Mom's health can't handle this stress. That was the lever he reached for when nothing else worked. I exhaled slowly. Then she shouldn't have created a situation that required legal review. He hung up. My mother waited until Sunday. She showed up at my apartment without calling. I opened the door and found her standing there in a wool coat, perfectly composed, lips pressed tight. You humiliated us, she said, stepping inside without invitation. I closed the door behind her. You handled this privately, she continued. It didn't need to involve outsiders. You involved outsiders when you changed legal documents, I said. She waved a hand. You know what I mean. I do, I said calmly. You mean people who won't question you. Her eyes sharpened. You're being dramatic. I'm being precise. She looked around my apartment, taking in the modest furniture, the neat stacks of files on the table, the evidence of a life she had always described as provisional. You don't need the house, she said. You've always been adaptable. That sentence hurt more than I expected. Not because it was cruel, because it was true. She had trained me to survive with less, to make myself small, to be flexible so others could remain comfortable. I didn't need it, I said, but you didn't have the right to take it. Her voice rose. Everything I did was for this family. For the version of it you control, I replied. She stared at me, then laughed softly. You think a lawyer changes anything? You'll regret this. I already regret not acting sooner, I said. That stopped her. For a moment I saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not guilt, calculation. She left without another word. The next week Rachel called. They're pushing back, she said. As expected, but they made a mistake. What kind, I asked. They moved funds after receiving notice. I closed my eyes. That's not allowed, is it? No, Rachel said. It's very much not. The injunction was filed the same day. By Thursday, Mercer and Lane Logistics was under review. By Friday, Caleb was removed as acting sole decision-maker pending resolution. The company board requested documentation I knew my mother couldn't produce. And suddenly the narrative shifted. No one was asking why I was making trouble. They were asking why my mother had gone to such lengths to avoid transparency. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell anyone. I went to work, cooked dinner, slept 8 hours a night. Because the moment I stopped trying to win approval, my life became startlingly simple. The real confrontation hadn't happened yet, but the balance had already shifted, and my family could feel it. Silence is different when it's no longer protective. Before, silence had been something my family used like insulation. It kept uncomfortable truths from spreading. It softened sharp edges. It allowed people to pretend nothing had changed, even as the ground shifted beneath them. Now the silence was tense. It followed my mother into rooms. It sat beside Caleb at meetings. It pressed against conversations that used to glide easily on assumptions no one questioned. Rachel called it institutional discomfort. They're used to control without scrutiny, she told me over the phone. Once that's gone, everything feels louder to them. What she didn't say, but didn't need to, was that discomfort makes people careless. The first crack came from someone I hadn't thought about in years, a woman named Denise Harper. She was the office manager at Mercer and Lane Logistics. She'd worked there longer than anyone except my uncle, who had retired quietly 5 years earlier. Denise was efficient, observant, and famously loyal to my father. She emailed me directly, subject line checking in. The message itself was short. I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I've been asked to provide documentation related to recent changes. Some of this doesn't align with what your father had on record. If you have time, I'd appreciate a conversation. I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. I'm available tomorrow afternoon. We met at a coffee shop near the warehouse. Neutral territory. Public enough to feel safe. Quiet enough to talk. Denise looked tired. Not overwhelmed, just disappointed in the way people look when systems they believed in start to rot from the inside. I never thought it would get like this, she said, stirring her coffee she didn't drink. Neither did I replied. She slid a folder across the table. Your father was meticulous, she said. He kept backups of everything. He didn't trust memory. He trusted paper. Inside were copies of emails, handwritten notes, meeting summaries, all dated before his stroke. One note caught my eye immediately. Equal partnership for the kids, non-negotiable. My throat tightened, but I kept my face still. They asked me to retroactively adjust some logs, Denise continued. Nothing illegal on its own, just selective. I couldn't do it. Who asked? I asked, even though I already knew. She didn't hesitate. Your mother, through Caleb. That night I forwarded everything to Rachel. Her reply came an hour later. This is significant. Thank Denise for me. We're moving faster now. The next move didn't come from us. It came from the bank. An automated notice. Routine on the surface. But the timing was wrong. My mother had attempted to transfer a portion of the investment account into a new vehicle under Caleb's name, citing estate streamlining. After the injunction, that triggered an internal audit. Rachel called me that evening, her voice calm but edged with satisfaction. They just undermined their own credibility, she said. Again. I sat on my couch phone pressed to my ear, feeling something close to relief, but not quite there yet. What happens now? I asked. Now, she said, they answer questions they can't charm their way out of. The questions came quickly. Why were assets moved without full beneficiary disclosure? Why was the will not presented in its original form to all interested parties? Why had my relocation been documented as voluntary when evidence suggested otherwise? My mother called me 3 times in one day. I didn't answer. Caleb left a voicemail that was long, rambling, and panicked. Hannah, this is getting out of hand. They're treating us like criminals. Mom's beside herself. You got what you wanted. Can we stop now? I deleted it without replying, because this wasn't about what I wanted. It was about what had been taken. The confrontation happened the following week, not in a courtroom, but in a conference room at the bank. Neutral walls, glass table, bottled water no one touched. My mother sat across from me, posture rigid. Caleb beside her, jaw tight, eyes darting. Their attorney sat to the side, expression carefully unreadable. Rachel sat next to me, composed, hands folded. The bank's compliance officer led the meeting. This is a fact-finding session, he said, not an accusation. We need clarity. Clarity was the one thing my family had avoided for years. They didn't look at me when they spoke. They spoke around me, about me. She moved out. She was always independent. She didn't object at the time. Rachel waited, then slid Denise's folder onto the table. Actually, she said calmly, she did not move out permanently. And she did not consent, and the records support that. The compliance officer leafed through the pages. My mother's face tightened. That note, she said sharply, was informal. My husband was sentimental. Rachel smiled just slightly. Sentiment doesn't invalidate intent, she replied, especially when intent is consistent over time. Caleb finally looked at me. You could have just talked to us, he said, frustration leaking through his controlled tone. I met his eyes. I tried, I said. You decided I didn't need to be heard. The room went quiet. The compliance officer cleared his throat. We'll need to freeze the accounts pending resolution, he said. And we'll be recommending independent oversight. My mother's hand trembled just barely. This is unnecessary, she said. No, I said quietly. It's overdue. That was the moment something shifted. Not externally. Internally. I saw them clearly, not as villains, not as monsters, just people who had mistaken my silence for permission. The meeting ended without resolution, but the direction was set. Outside in the parking lot, my mother finally broke. You're doing this to punish me, she said, voice tight. No, I replied. I'm doing this to stop pretending. She stared at me like I'd spoken another language. Caleb said nothing. He looked smaller somehow, less certain. As I drove away, I felt the weight I'd been carrying begin to lift. Not because it was over, but because I was no longer carrying it alone. The consequences were moving now, quietly, methodically, and my family was starting to understand something they never had before. Silence doesn't mean compliance. Sometimes it's just the space before accountability arrives. When people lose control, they reach for the oldest tools they know. My family reached for narrative. Within a week of the bank meeting, the story began circulating quietly through extended relatives and family friends. Not loudly, not publicly, just enough to frame me before I could frame myself. I was stressed. I was grieving. I had always been sensitive. I was misinterpreting things. I had let outsiders poison my view of the family. It was careful, strategic, familiar. I heard it first from my Aunt Marlene, my mother's older sister, who called me one evening just to check in. "I don't want to take sides," she said immediately, which is what people say right before they do. "But your mom is heartbroken. She doesn't understand why you do this to her." To her, I repeated, "Yes," Marlene said gently, "after everything she's done for you." I leaned back against my kitchen counter and closed my eyes. "I didn't do anything to her," I said. "I asked for transparency." "Well," Marlene continued, "it's all gotten very complicated. People are worried you're being influenced." "By whom?" I asked. There was a pause. "Your lawyer." I almost smiled. "Then those people don't understand how lawyers work," I said. "Or how documents work." Marlene sighed. "Hannah, you've always been the difficult one." There it was. Not cruel, not shouted, just stated as fact. "I'll let you go," I said calmly. "But I won't be discussing this with anyone except through counsel." She sounded surprised. "You don't need to be so formal." "Yes," I said, "I do." After I hung up, I sat very still for a long time. This was the part I had expected but still hadn't fully prepared for. Not the legal resistance, the emotional one, the quiet social pressure designed to herd me back into place. It would have worked once. Years ago, I would have apologized just to restore peace. I would have explained myself into exhaustion, hoping clarity would soften things. But something had shifted. I wasn't asking them to understand me anymore. I was asking them to respect boundaries. And those are very different requests. 2 days later, Caleb showed up at my apartment. He didn't knock hard. He knocked carefully, like someone approaching an animal they weren't sure would bite. "I just want to talk," he said when I opened the door. I stepped aside and let him in. He looked around like he was seeing my space for the first time. The order, the quiet, the absence of chaos. "You doing okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on knees. "Mom's not sleeping," he said. "She's barely eating. This is really affecting her." I waited. "You know she didn't mean to hurt you," he added. I tilted my head slightly. "Caleb," I said, "intent doesn't erase outcome." He frowned. "So what, you're just going to burn everything down?" "No," I said. "I'm letting it be examined." He ran a hand through his hair. "This is tearing the family apart." I looked at him carefully. "The family held together because I absorbed discomfort quietly," I said. "That's not cohesion. That's containment." He looked away. "You always analyze everything," he muttered. "And you avoid it," I replied. "That's why this worked for as long as it did." That landed harder than I expected. He stood abruptly. "What do you want?" It was the first honest question he'd asked. "I want what Dad decided," I said, "and I want you to stop pretending you didn't know this was happening." He turned back to me, eyes sharp. "You think I planned this?" "I think you benefited from not questioning it," I said. And that was enough. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He left without another word. That night, Rachel emailed me an update. My mother's attorney had requested mediation, quietly, urgently. "They're trying to regain control of the process," Rachel wrote. "Mediation isn't bad, but timing matters. They wouldn't be asking if they felt secure." I stared at the screen. "Do we agree?" I typed back. Rachel responded quickly. "We don't refuse, we don't rush, we let the pressure sit." The pressure was already doing its work. The logistics company board had scheduled an emergency review of governance procedures. Denise was cooperating fully. My uncle, retired and previously disengaged, had requested copies of everything for his own understanding. That detail mattered. He had been the quiet one, the one who watched. My mother called again the following morning. I let it go to voicemail. "Hannah," she said, voice tight but controlled. "This has gone far enough. We can settle this privately. I don't know why you're insisting on humiliating us." Humiliation. The word she chose carefully, as if fairness itself were an attack. I forwarded the voicemail to Rachel. Her reply was brief. "They're afraid." I realized then that fear didn't look the way I'd imagined. It didn't look like remorse. It looked like urgency, narrative control, desperation to close doors before more people looked inside. That afternoon, I received an email from the mediator's office. A proposed date, a neutral location. I agreed. Not because I wanted peace, but because I wanted everything on record. Because when people who manipulate behind closed doors are forced into structured transparency, they make mistakes. And mistakes leave trails. I spent that evening walking through my neighborhood as the sun dipped low, the cold air sharp against my face. I wasn't grieving my family anymore. I was grieving the version of myself that believed endurance was the same as love. That version had kept me safe once. But she wasn't needed now. Something else had taken her place. Someone quieter, firmer. Someone who understood that dignity isn't loud and revenge doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like letting people speak long enough to reveal exactly who they are. Mediation didn't take place in a courtroom. It took place in a conference suite at a downtown office building that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and burnt coffee. Neutral ground, neutral walls. A long table designed to make everyone feel equally small. That was the point. I arrived 10 minutes early. Rachel was already there reviewing notes with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where the pressure points were and had no intention of touching them yet. My mother arrived precisely on time. She wore a tailored navy coat and carried herself with the same practiced composure she'd used my entire life. Caleb followed a step behind jaw-tight eyes already scanning the room for exits. The mediator, Thomas Avery, introduced himself with a calm, measured tone. Mid-50s, gray at the temples, the kind of man who had seen enough family implosions to know that the loudest person in the room was rarely the most honest. He explained the rules: confidentiality, respectful dialogue, one person speaking at a time. My mother nodded graciously as if she were hosting. Caleb avoided my eyes. We sat. So Thomas began folding his hands. We're here to discuss concerns related to estate management and asset distribution following the passing of Robert Mercer. My goal is not to assign blame, but to clarify positions and explore resolution. My mother leaned forward immediately. This has all been a misunderstanding, she said smoothly. Grief does strange things to people. Rachel didn't react. I didn't react. Thomas turned to me. Hannah, would you like to explain your concerns in your own words? I took a breath, not to steady myself, just to begin. My concern, I said, is that my father's documented wishes were altered after his death without my knowledge or consent. And those alterations materially excluded me from assets I was legally entitled to. No emotion, no accusation, just fact. My mother's lips tightened. That's a very cold way to frame family decisions, she said. I'm not framing family, I replied. I'm framing documents. Thomas raised a hand, slightly signaling pause. Eleanor, he said, can you explain why the amendment was filed without Hannah's involvement? My mother smiled faintly. Hannah had already moved on, she said. She had her own place, her own life. Caleb was present, invested. It made sense to simplify. To simplify for whom, Rachel asked calmly. My mother turned toward her, irritation flashing briefly before she masked it. For the family, she said, for continuity. Rachel nodded once. And by continuity you mean consolidating control. Caleb shifted in his seat. This is getting adversarial, he said. No, Thomas said gently. This is getting specific. He turned back to my mother. Did Hannah ever sign a document relinquishing her interest? No, my mother said, but did she verbally agree? She didn't object. Rachel leaned forward slightly. Silence is not consent, she said, especially when information is withheld. My mother's composure cracked just enough to be noticeable. You're turning this into something ugly, she snapped. I did what any mother would do to protect her family. I met her gaze. You did what benefited you, I said quietly. And Caleb. Caleb finally looked at me then. That's not fair, he said. You weren't even here most of the time. I didn't raise my voice. I was here when Dad needed care, I said. I was here when vendors called. I was here when you couldn't be. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Thomas glanced down at his notes. I'd like to address a specific point, he said. The claim that Hannah's relocation was voluntary. He looked at me. Can you clarify? I maintained my apartment throughout, I said. I have lease agreements, payment records, and written requests from my mother asking me to stay temporarily to assist with my father's care. Rachel slid copies across the table. My mother didn't touch them. That's selective, she said. She always had one foot out the door. That doesn't negate her legal standing, Thomas replied. There was a long pause, the kind that stretches not because no one has anything to say, but because someone realizes the story they've been telling no longer works. Caleb broke it. So what he said, frustration creeping into his voice. You want half of everything now, is that it? I looked at him. I want what Dad decided, I said, nothing more, nothing less. And if that hurts Mom, he asked. I held his gaze. Then it hurts because the truth finally arrived, I said, not because I delivered it. My mother's voice rose. You're tearing us apart over money. I shook my head slowly. This was never about money, I said. It's about control. Money is just how you expressed it. Thomas cleared his throat. I think it's important to acknowledge something he said. This dispute exists because decisions were made unilaterally. That's the root. He turned to my mother. If we proceed formally, there is risk. To reputations. to relationships, to outcomes you may not like. She stared at the table, fingers clenched. "What do you want?" she asked me, finally, voice tight. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit. "I want an independent administrator appointed," I said. "I want the assets frozen until a full accounting is completed. And I want acknowledgement that what was done was improper." Caleb scoffed softly. "You want an apology?" "No," I said. "I want accountability." Those two words landed hard. My mother looked up, eyes sharp, wounded pride flaring. "I will not be made the villain," she said. Rachel spoke gently. "No one has to be a villain," she said, "but someone has to be responsible." The meeting ended without a settlement. But something important had happened. For the first time, my mother hadn't been able to reframe the room. For the first time, Caleb had been forced to hear the truth without my smoothing it over for him. As we stood to leave, Thomas said something quietly that only I heard. "This won't stay unresolved," he said. "People who avoid clarity rarely win against it." Outside, the air was cold and clean. Rachel walked beside me. "You did well," she said. "I didn't do anything," I replied. She smiled slightly. "You stayed still while the ground shifted," she said. "That's harder." That night, my mother didn't call. Caleb didn't text. The silence had changed again. It wasn't defensive now. It was uncertain. And uncertainty, when introduced into systems built on control, has a way of doing real damage. The review began without ceremony. No announcement, no dramatic letters. Just emails that landed quietly in inboxes and calendar invitations marked mandatory. The kind of process that doesn't feel dangerous until you realize how little control you have once it starts. An independent administrator was appointed within 10 days. His name was Michael Trent, late 40s, former forensic accountant turned estate oversight specialist. He had the demeanor of someone who didn't need to intimidate because he trusted procedure to do that for him. Michael requested everything: bank statements, meeting minutes, emails, texts, vendor contracts, versions of documents that had been updated, revised, or streamlined. He didn't ask for explanations first. He asked for records. That was where the real panic began. My mother called me on the third day of the review. Not angry, not composed. Worried. "They're asking about things that don't matter," she said. "Old transactions, minor adjustments. This is excessive." "It's thorough," I replied. "You wanted fairness," she snapped. "This feels like punishment." "It feels like scrutiny," I said. "Those are different things." She went quiet. "They're looking at the company too," she said finally. "That wasn't necessary." "That wasn't my decision," I replied. Another pause. "They're asking about a consulting fee from 2 years ago," she added, voice tight. "One you don't even remember." I did remember, because I'd questioned it at the time. A 5-figure payment to a strategic advisor whose name didn't appear anywhere else in the company records. When I asked, my mother told me not to worry, that Dad had approved it verbally. Dad hadn't spoken clearly in months by then. "I remember," I said. Her voice hardened. "You always do." The call ended shortly after. That evening, Denise emailed me again. "They're asking about the Mercer Holdings account," she wrote. "Specifically withdrawals made during your father's illness." My stomach tightened, but my voice stayed calm when I called her. "Are the records complete?" I asked. "Yes," she said, "that's the problem." The withdrawals weren't massive. They were frequent, small enough not to trigger alarms on their own, regular enough to establish a pattern. Personal expenses routed through business accounts. Travel reimbursements that didn't align with meetings. Consulting fees with no deliverables attached. Nothing that screamed criminal, but enough to raise questions. Michael Trent requested interviews. Caleb went first. He emerged from his session, pale jaw, clenched eyes unfocused. He didn't look at me. My mother went next. She was in there for nearly 2 hours. When she came out, her posture was different. Less upright, less certain. She didn't speak to me. I was called in last. Michael greeted me politely and gestured to a chair. "This isn't an interrogation," he said. "It's context." I nodded. "Tell me about your role during your father's illness," he said. So I did. I talked about schedules, about managing calls, about the logistics work I'd done quietly without title or authority because someone had to. I talked about the night I found a stack of unpaid invoices hidden in a drawer and spent hours sorting them so vendors wouldn't pull contracts. I talked about the consulting payment I'd questioned. Michael took notes, asked clarifying questions, never interrupted. "Did you benefit financially from any of these decisions?" he asked eventually. "No," I said. "Did you object at the time?" "Yes," I replied, "but I was told not to interfere." He nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. "That's all I need for now." A week later, the interim findings were circulated to the involved parties. Not conclusions, observations. Language like inconsistencies, unsupported transfers, and procedural irregularities. The phrase that mattered most appeared on page 3. Pattern of unilateral decision making inconsistent with fiduciary duty. Caleb called me that night. His voice sounded different, quieter, stripped of its usual defensiveness. They're saying Mom could be personally liable, he said. I know, I replied. This could ruin her. I didn't answer right away. I chose my words carefully. She made choices, I said. The review didn't create them. He exhaled sharply. You don't understand what this is doing to her. I understand, I said. I lived inside it for years. Silence. Then unexpectedly his voice broke. I didn't think it would go this far. That's because you never had to think about consequences, I said gently. Someone else always absorbed them. He didn't argue. That was new. 2 days later, my uncle requested a private conversation with me. We met at his house, a modest place near the lake. He moved slowly now, arthritis stiffening his hands, but his mind was sharp. I stayed quiet too long, he said after I told him everything. Your father trusted your mother to do right by both of you. That trust was misplaced. Hearing someone else say it out loud shifted something inside me. You're not wrong for pushing back, he added. You're late. I smiled faintly. I know. The next development came quietly. The administrator recommended restoring my voting rights in the company pending final resolution. Caleb lost sole authority. Board oversight increased. My mother's access to discretionary accounts was restricted. Nothing dramatic, but everything changed. The family dynamic didn't explode. It deflated. Without unchecked power, the emotional gravity that had pulled everyone into orbit around my mother weakened. She didn't call anymore. Caleb stopped trying to negotiate through guilt. They were adjusting to a world where I was no longer invisible. And that more than any courtroom outcome unsettled them deeply. Because once people see you clearly, they can't unsee you. And once systems adapt to your presence, they don't go back. The final decisions didn't arrive all at once. They arrived in pieces, memos, emails, carefully worded recommendations that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Michael Trent scheduled a closing review meeting for early March. Not mediation, not negotiation, resolution. By then, the tension in my family had settled into something dull and heavy. No more frantic calls, no more attempts to reframe the story, just a shared unspoken awareness that the outcome was no longer theirs to shape. Rachel and I arrived together. She looked calm as she always did before something decisive. Calm not because she expected victory, but because she trusted process. My mother arrived alone this time. Caleb came separately. They didn't sit together. That small detail said more than anything else. Michael opened the meeting without preamble. Thank you for your cooperation during the review, he said. We've completed our assessment and are prepared to make recommendations to the court if necessary. No one interrupted. The findings indicate repeated breaches of fiduciary duty. He continued, voice even. Not criminal in nature, but significant enough to warrant corrective action. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. The primary issue, Michael said, was the consolidation of control without informed consent of all beneficiaries. He turned slightly toward me. Specifically, the exclusion of Hannah Mercer from decisions and distributions she was legally entitled to. Caleb stared at the table. Michael laid out the recommendations. The trust amendment would be voided. The original will would be honored. Assets would be redistributed accordingly. An independent administrator would remain in place for a minimum of 18 months. My mother would be required to reimburse the estate for certain unsupported expenses. There would be no penalties beyond that. No public findings. No reputational escalation. A chance to correct, not destroy. I listened without reacting. This wasn't vindication. It was alignment. Michael finished and folded his hands. These recommendations prioritize restoration over punishment, he said. They are contingent on acceptance. Otherwise, we proceed formally. The room was quiet. My mother spoke first. This is excessive, she said, but her voice lacked force. You're dismantling a structure that worked. It worked for you, Michael replied calmly. Not for everyone. She turned to me, then eyes sharp wounded. You could stop this, she said. You could agree to less. We could settle quietly. I met her gaze. No, I said. One word, no explanation. Caleb finally spoke. If we accept, he asked, this ends here, Rachel answered. It ends the review, she said. Not the consequences of your choices. He nodded slowly. My mother looked between us, searching for leverage that no longer existed. When she realized there was none, something in her posture collapsed inward. Fine, she said flatly, accept it. The word hung in the air. Michael nodded once. I'll draft the final documents, he said. You'll receive them by the end of the week." The meeting ended. Outside, the sky was low and gray, the kind of day that feels heavier than it looks. Rachel walked with me to the elevator. "You handled that cleanly," she said. "I didn't feel anything," I replied. "That comes later," she said. "Or it doesn't. Either way is normal." The paperwork arrived on Friday. I read every page. I signed where required. I didn't celebrate. I went for a long walk instead, letting the cold air clear my head. Restoration didn't feel like triumph. It felt like gravity returning to its proper direction. The following week, Caleb asked to meet. We chose a diner halfway between our places. Neutral, familiar. The kind of place we used to stop at after school when Dad picked us up late. Caleb looked tired, older than he had a month ago. "I didn't know," he said after we ordered, "about a lot of it." I believed him. "I should have asked," he added. "I didn't want to rock the boat." "That was the boat," I said. He nodded, swallowing. "I don't know where this leaves us," he said. "I don't either," I replied. "But it won't work if I'm invisible again." "I know," he said quietly. That was all. My mother didn't reach out. She complied through attorneys, through administrators, through systems that didn't care about tone or history. The house was put into a formal trust structure. My name restored on documents where it had quietly disappeared. I didn't move back in. I didn't want to, because this had never been about a house. It was about being erased, and that had been corrected. One evening, weeks later, I stood in my apartment looking around at the life I had rebuilt without asking permission. I felt lighter, not because I had won, but because I had stopped bending. Control costs something, not always immediately, but eventually. And when the bill comes due, it doesn't care how justified you felt at the time. It only cares what you did. After everything settled on paper, the world didn't change the way people expect it to. There were no apologies delivered at my door. No dramatic realizations. No sudden warmth where there had been control before. What followed was quieter than that. It was absence. My mother withdrew in a way that felt deliberate, not wounded. She communicated only through the administrator or attorneys. Short, efficient exchanges stripped of tone. Compliance without connection. Caleb tried in small, awkward ways to bridge something he didn't yet understand. He sent a text on my birthday. He asked how work was going. He mentioned the house once, then quickly changed the subject. We were learning new rules without saying them out loud. At Mercer and Lane Logistics, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. With oversight in place, meetings became slower, more cautious. Decisions were documented. Authority was shared instead of assumed. People asked me questions now, not out of guilt, out of necessity. I attended my first board meeting as a full voting member 2 weeks after the review concluded. I sat in the same room where I'd once taken notes silently, while others spoke over me. No one apologized for that either. They simply adjusted. And that I learned is how most power shifts actually happen, not with regret. With recalibration. Outside of work, my life simplified. I stopped checking my phone constantly. I slept through the night. I made plans without calculating how they might inconvenience someone else. One evening, I found myself standing in the grocery store aisle staring at nothing in particular and realized something unsettling. I was no longer bracing. For years, I had moved through life with a low-level tension in my body, like I was waiting for the next request, the next correction, the next subtle signal that I was too much or not enough. That tension was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar. Neutrality. Caleb invited me to dinner a month later. Just the two of us. I hesitated before saying yes. Not because I was angry, but because I wasn't sure what I was willing to offer anymore. We met at a small Italian place near the river. Nothing fancy. Familiar food, safe distance. "I'm not here to fix things," he said early on. "I just don't want them to stay broken without trying." I appreciated the honesty. "I'm not interested in pretending," I said. "So if that's what you need, this won't work." He nodded. "I know." We talked about work, about logistics, about Dad. When he mentioned Mom, his voice tightened slightly. "She doesn't know what to do without control," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. "She keeps saying you humiliated her." I set my fork down. "I didn't humiliate her," I said. "I stopped absorbing it for her." He didn't argue. "I wish I'd been braver," he said after a moment. "That's something you'll have to live with," I replied. "Not something I can fix." He accepted that. When we parted, there was no hug, just a nod, an acknowledgement. It wasn't reconciliation. It was recognition. A few days later, I received a letter from my mother. Not an email, not a message passed through someone else. A letter. The handwriting was controlled, deliberate. She wrote about stress, about how hard the last year had been, about feeling betrayed. She did not apologize. She did not acknowledge specifics. She ended with, "I hope in time you understand why I did what I did." I read it once, Then I folded it and placed it in a drawer. Understanding was no longer my responsibility. That realization felt like freedom. At work, I began pushing for changes I'd once kept to myself. Better reporting, clearer accountability, protections for employees who spoke up. Not because I was angry, because I had learned firsthand what happens when systems depend on silence. One afternoon, Denise stopped by my office. "You know," she said, leaning against the doorframe, "things feel different now." "Better?" I asked. "Clearer," she replied. "That matters more." She was right. Clarity doesn't always make things comfortable, but it makes them real. As spring edged closer, I found myself thinking less about what had been taken from me and more about what I was no longer willing to give. My time, my silence, my compliance. Those had been the real inheritance my family had assumed they owned. They were wrong. One evening, as I locked up my apartment and stepped into the cooling air, I felt something settle into place. Not closure. Choice. I could maintain limited contact. I could rebuild selectively. I could walk away entirely if I needed to. For the first time, those options belonged to me. And that was the most valuable thing I had recovered. The final test didn't come wrapped in anger or threats. It came disguised as tradition. In early December, Caleb called me late in the afternoon. His voice sounded careful, rehearsed in the way people speak when they already know the answer might hurt. "Mom wants to do Christmas," he said, "at the house." I leaned against my kitchen counter and watched the light fade through the window. "The house," I repeated. "Yes," he said quickly. "Just dinner, nothing formal. She says it would mean a lot." There it was. The old pressure point. Holidays. Togetherness. The unspoken expectation that time and ritual could smooth over everything that had been exposed. "I need to know what you're asking," I said. He hesitated. "She wants things to feel normal again." Normal. A word that had once meant silence, compliance, and carefully edited versions of myself. "I'll think about it," I said. That night I didn't decide. I let the question sit with me not as an obligation, but as a choice. For years, Christmas had been about endurance. About showing up smiling, absorbing small comments that chipped away at me while pretending they didn't matter. This year was different. This year I noticed how my body reacted just thinking about walking back into that house. The tightness in my chest, the subtle readiness to defend. That told me everything I needed to know. 2 days later, my mother called. "I hear you're hesitant," she said, skipping pleasantries. "That's disappointing." I stayed quiet. "We are still a family," she continued. "Legal matters don't change that." "They changed how you treated me," I said. A sharp inhale on the other end. "You're holding on to bitterness," she said. "That's unhealthy." I almost smiled. "No," I said. "I'm holding on to boundaries." She scoffed. "Boundaries are just walls people put up when they don't want to forgive." "Forgiveness doesn't require access," I replied. "And it doesn't require pretending." Her tone hardened. "So you're punishing me?" I let the silence stretch. "No," I said finally, "I'm choosing myself." That was the moment. The moment where the conversation stopped circling and landed exactly where it needed to. "You think you're better than us now?" she said quietly. I closed my eyes. "No," I replied. "I think I deserve the same respect you give yourself." She didn't respond. The line went dead. I declined the invitation the next morning, briefly, politely, no explanations. Caleb didn't argue. He just said I understand in a way that suggested he was starting to. On Christmas Eve, I cooked dinner for one. Not out of loneliness, but intention. I opened a bottle of wine, played music I liked, and let the evening move slowly. There was no tension in my body, no anticipation of conflict, just quiet. That night I realized something important. Family isn't defined by proximity. It isn't sustained by tradition alone. And it isn't repaired by pretending harm didn't happen. Family is defined by safety. And I felt safe. The following week, the final documents were filed with the court. The administrator's role was formalized. The estate settled into its corrected structure. It was done. Nothing dramatic marked the end. No speech, no announcement, just the quiet certainty that something irreversible had occurred. I had stepped out of a system that relied on my silence. And systems like that don't forget when someone leaves. They adjust, or they crumble. Either way, they no longer control the narrative. As the year turned, I stood on my balcony one cold evening and watched the city lights flicker on one by one. I thought about the girl I had been, the one who stayed, the one who endured, the one who believed that love was something you earned by making yourself smaller. I felt tenderness for her, but I didn't miss her, because the woman I had become didn't need permission to exist. Time doesn't rush to prove a point. It waits. The months after Christmas passed quietly, marked more by what didn't happen than what did. No surprise visits, no emotional letters, no sudden breakthroughs wrapped in regret, just distance. At first, that distance felt deliberate, like my mother was withholding contact as a form of punishment. That had always been her way. Silence as leverage, absence as message. But as winter gave way to spring, I began to understand something else was happening. She wasn't punishing me. She was adjusting to a reality where her absence no longer controlled me. Caleb checked in occasionally. Short messages, neutral updates. He told me the house felt different, too quiet. He said Mom spent more time in her room watching television with the volume low, as if sound itself had become intrusive. She keeps asking when you'll come by, he said during one call. I didn't respond immediately. Do you want me to? He asked carefully. I considered the question. No, I said, not right now. He accepted that without argument. That was new. At work, the changes we'd implemented began to show results. Clear reporting reduced tension. Shared authority slowed decisions but strengthened them. Employees spoke up more. Problems surfaced earlier when they were still fixable. One afternoon, the board chair pulled me aside after a meeting. You're different than you used to be, he said. I waited. More grounded, he added, less willing to gloss over things. I learned the cost of that, I replied. He nodded, understanding more than he said. Outside of work, my life filled in quietly. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected while trying to manage my family's needs. I took a weekend trip alone, something I'd never allowed myself to do without justification. I stopped explaining my choices. That was the real shift. The letter from my mother came in late April. Not long, not dramatic. She wrote that she missed me, that the house didn't feel like home anymore, that she hadn't realized how much I'd done until no one was there to do it. She still didn't apologize. But she also didn't accuse. That too was new. I read the letter twice, then set it aside. Missing someone is not the same as respecting them, and I needed to see the difference clearly before I responded. In May, Caleb asked if I'd meet him again. We walked along the river this time, the path crowded with joggers and families enjoying the warmer weather. She's not well, he said quietly. Not medically, just hollow. I stopped walking and turned to him. Is this about her, I asked, or about you needing me to fix something? He hesitated, then sighed. Both, he admitted. I appreciated the honesty. I can't be the solution anymore, I said. Not for her, not for you. He nodded, eyes down. I know, he said. I just needed to hear it. We stood there for a moment, watching the water move steadily past us, unbothered by our pause. She doesn't understand why you won't come back, he added. I didn't leave, I said. I stopped performing. That landed. Weeks later, my mother requested a meeting. Not through lawyers. Through Caleb. She says she just wants coffee, he told me. Public, no pressure. I thought about it longer than I expected to. Not because I was afraid. Because I was weighing whether there was anything left to protect. We met at a small cafe near her neighborhood. She arrived early, already seated, hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking. She looked older. Not fragile, just worn. I won't stay long, I said as I sat. She nodded. I don't understand this version of you, she said softly. You used to need us. I met her gaze. I used to believe love required surrender, I said. I don't anymore. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. You think I don't love you, she said. I think you love the version of me you could manage, I replied. She looked away. We sat in silence for a long moment. I don't know how to be your mother without control, she said finally. That was the closest she'd come to truth. I don't know how to be your daughter without shrinking, I said. We finished our coffee without resolution. When we stood to leave, she reached out as if to hug me, then stopped herself. That hesitation told me everything. The door was no longer automatic. It required permission. And permission, once withdrawn, is not easily returned. As I walked to my car, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. Not because things were over, but because they were finally honest. The last shift didn't announce itself. It came quietly the way real endings usually do. One morning in early summer, I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about my mother or my brother in days. Not with effort, not with avoidance, just absence. The kind that doesn't ache anymore because the wound has finally closed. I made coffee and stood by the window while the city woke up below me. Cars moved, people walked. Life continued without checking whether I was ready for it. And for the first time, I was. The administrator's 18-month term ticked on without drama. The estate settled into its corrected shape. The company stabilized. My role became ordinary in the best way. No longer symbolic, no longer reactive, just real. Nothing else needed to be reclaimed. Because the most important thing had already been returned to me long before the paperwork was finalized. My autonomy. Caleb called one last time that summer. Not in crisis, not asking for help. Just checking in. She's moving to a smaller place, he said. Says the house is too big. I absorbed that quietly. I think it's good, he added, as if waiting for approval. I think it's her choice, I said. He was quiet for a moment. You really changed, he said. No, I replied. I stopped pretending. We talked a little longer. About work, about nothing. When we hung up, I didn't feel relief or regret, just neutrality, which I had learned was its own kind of peace. A few weeks later, I received the final notice from the court. The administrator's recommendations were adopted in full. No appeals, no objections. Closed. I filed the document away and went for a walk. That evening, I sat alone on my balcony as the sky darkened, the city lights blinking on one by one. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who stayed quiet to keep harmony, the one who believed loyalty meant endurance. She had done her best with what she knew, but she wasn't needed anymore. I didn't forgive my mother in a ceremonial way. I didn't absolve her. I didn't rewrite the past into something softer than it was. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a performance. It's a boundary you no longer need to defend. And I wasn't there yet. Maybe I never would be. And that was okay. Because healing doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like distance that no longer hurts. Sometimes it looks like choosing yourself without explaining why. Sometimes it looks like walking away without slamming the door. I had spent years believing that love required me to be flexible, quiet, agreeable. That being chosen meant making myself easy to manage. I know better now. Love that costs you your voice isn't love. Family that survives only on your silence isn't family. And peace that depends on shrinking is just another form of captivity. The real inheritance my father left me wasn't the house or the shares or the name on a document. It was the certainty that my life belonged to me. I carried that forward carefully, intentionally, without apology. If you've ever been excluded, erased, or pushed aside by the very people who were supposed to protect you, remember this. You don't need to fight louder. You don't need to explain harder. You don't need to prove your worth. Sometimes the strongest revenge is simply stepping out of the role they assigned you and refusing to return. Choosing yourself isn't cruelty, it's clarity. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like, comment, or subscribe. Tell me where you're listening from and what choosing yourself looked like in your life.